Well, welcome everybody. It's been my pleasure to introduce the first speakers. First of all, Vedita Kowalaso. She assures me that's how it's pronounced. She's from Mauritius, and she's doing a PhD in English with the department here at Warwick. She has a BA and an MA from Durham. Her research interests are South Asian fiction, both literary and popular, and the dynamics of different languages and their representations in English. Vedita grew up, I believe, speaking 5 different languages in Mauritius. She has... Yes?
Everybody does.
Yeah. She has an article out shortly on translating Indian English language novels back into Indian languages, bhashas, and an essay on the Hindi translation of Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy, and this will appear later this year. Today, she's examining sexual norms in translation with reference to Seth's A Suitable Boy and Rushdie's Midnight Children. Her title, Translating Sex, Negotiating the Boundaries of Sexual Desire in English Hindi Translations.
Thank you very much. Is it a good time? Whoops, sorry. That was a good start. Can everybody see? Is it a slide?
Turn down some lights.
All right. Thank you. I will start with an apology, and the apology is not for my title, so I do feel like somewhere I should probably apologize for the title too. The apology is I'm not going to concentrate as much on Rushdie as I promised in the abstract, because my research is quite intensive on Vikram Seth, and I thought I should probably not try to divert too much to a few weeks before submission. So, it's mostly a paper on Vikram Seth, A Suitable Boy, I'm afraid. The following passage is an extract from Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy, published in 1993. Of course, it's an English language Indian novel. And it's a description of the aftermath of sex, lovemaking between 2 characters, Meenakshi and Billy. I'm going to just read it out. So he, that is Billy, began to withdraw. "No, Billy, just stay where you are," said Meenakshi in a sighing voice. "You feel so nice." Billy had been at his athletic best. "All right," Billy consented. After a few minutes, though, as he softened, he had to pull out. Sorry. I did write that in Devanagari, but I think sometimes when you put it on another computer, the font changes. So I'm sorry about the font. I have the passage below on the right, so bottom right, is my translation of the Devanagari, but I'm sorry the Devanagari is not appearing. So I'll just read out my translation of the translation, if that makes sense. So Gopal Gandhi translates this passage as follows. "Now Billy wanted to get up. 'No, Billy, just stay where you are,' Meenakshi said, in a muffled voice. Like experienced athletes who had stepped into the arena, Billy was both soft and rough. 'All right,' Billy granted Meenakshi's request. But a little later, increasing relaxation forced them to disconnect. The bits in bold are clearly all additions to Seth's text. Like experienced athletes who had stepped into the arena. I mean, what does that even imply? Is it a comment on Billy's personality? Is it a character comment? Is it to take the focus away from the fact that this is a sex scene being described? Why translate as he softened, he had to pull out, into increasing relaxation forced them to disconnect? I mean, the description of an act of withdrawal of the sexual intercourse could not have received a more thorough masquerading, or a less erotic one for that matter. Along very similar lines, here is Lalit Karthikeyan translating Rushdie into Hindi. The ending of Rushdie's novel Shame is memorable for the way that the ruthless killing of the protagonist by his wife, who has by this point turned into a sort of feline creature, is also portrayed as being rife with sexual tension, which is in itself a candid reversal of the novel's theme, shame. Just to contextualize briefly for anyone who hasn't read the novel, the female protagonist, she's called Sufia Zenobia, she's born blushing in the novel for the very many causes of shame that are attributed to post-colonial Pakistan. By the end of the novel, Sufia Zenobia transgresses all boundaries of shame, throughout it is she who embodies shame on behalf of her family, her community, her sex, her country, etc. Until finally shame completely takes over her and her existence becomes a sort of celebration of violence, of sexual contravention and all of those factors for which she earlier blushed and felt shame. So anyway, this is the penultimate paragraph from the novel Shame. He stood beside the bed and he, meaning the protagonist, whose wife is Zofia Zinovia, he stood beside the bed and waited for her like a bridegroom on his wedding night, as she climbed towards him, roaring like a fire driven by the wind. The door blew open, and he in the darkness, erect, watching the approaching glow, and there she was on all fours, naked, coated in mud and blood and shit, with twigs sticking to her back and beetles in her hair. She saw him and shuddered. Then she rose up on her hind legs with her front paws outstretched, and he just had enough time to say, "Well, wife, so here you are at last," before her eyes forced him to look. The sexual undertones of this passage are blatant. However, Karthikeyan, translating this particular passage into Hindi, completely desexualizes it. Erect is translated as Tana Khara Tha, essentially meaning standing, literally standing in an upright or tensed way. Again, this particular description of what seems to be a penile erection is probably even more camouflage than Gandhi's attempt at disguising the act in a suitable boy. At one point, describing a penile erection, Gandhi refers to one character's sexual arousals as his dick cut. Dick cut has nothing to do with dick. Dick cut in Hindi, it means inconvenience, literally. So I would say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I am inconveniencing you, so I'm sorry for the dick cut." So in Hindi, both the sexual references in all the translations, or even the sensual undertones that permeate these passages, are either completely done away with or changed to mean something completely different. It could be argued that these are supposedly, and I use the word in between inverted commas, cultural translations, which maybe seek to take into account the incompatibilities of cultures in which English and Hindi, of which Hindi and English are respectively a sort of kind of cultural interface, if you like. After all, the Hindi language is also the medium for the notoriously prudish Bollywood films, which are arguably the most representative face of Hindi popular culture. In several of these Hindi language films, quasi-puritanical depiction of sexuality and physical intimacy are stereotypes which abound. For the longest time in Hindi cinema, a lady in a clinging wet see-through sari, I have a slide for that, sorry. See-through sari would be the peak and sometimes extent of sensuality. Think of Kishore Kumar crooning "Ek ladki bhigi bhagi si" means a girl dripping wet, literally, to a thoroughly drenched Madhubala in the Hindi film Chalti Ka Naam Gadi. That's on, that's a picture above. Lovers kissing on screen would often be symbolized for a cut from the scene of the increasing intimacy between lovers to a shot of trees or flowers shaking and swaying in the wind, or birds soaring into the sky. I mean, in the picture on the bottom right there, the lovers are literally about to hide behind the tree, and they literally start shaking the tree rather violently to suggest that they might be sharing a kiss. Raj Kapoor and Nargis in that in the one on the right, singing it's a rather famous erotically charged song, "Pyar Hua Ikrar Hua," meaning we're in love and we have admitted it, so it was as an act of rebellion. They stand under an umbrella in the rain, and literally just about as the male protagonist is about to kiss the female protagonist, she turns away, and that's where the shot is taken from. Sex was suggested by someone, almost invariably a man, switching off a bedside lamp, or through a dimming of lights on the soundstage while the scene blurred and faded out. Crushing of flowers under one's feet or with the palms of one's hands, usually while lying on a fully decked bed, suggested marriage consummation. Or more charmingly, the camera would sometimes roll away from the couple advancing towards the bed to a picture of a grinning toddler, presumably to hint at the nature of the act being performed away from the prying lenses of the camera. Do we have time? I just want to show you one of my favorite representations of, is that all right?
Yeah.
Of this trope, and it's only going to be about 30 seconds, so hopefully it's not. So this is from a film called Aradhana. It's basically the same depiction of sex. Oh, kissing even. Oh, I thought you had The translation of that is the society is trying to stop us, trying to keep us apart, but essentially urges are stronger than society. I don't think I need to explain the symbolism of the roaring fire and then the thunder and then suddenly roaring fire and all of that. It's pretty obvious. Thank you. Sorry. Oops. Sorry. Yeah. So all in all, it would seem that sexual conservatism is in the very DNA of the Hindi language film industry. But the same logic that drives Bollywood films seems to be the parameter followed by Gandhi and Kartikeya in translating from English to Hindi. And yet the longer history of bhashas, by bhashas I mean Indian languages, indigenous Indian languages such as Hindi, Bengali, Urdu, Tamil, all of that. The longer history of bhashas in India shows a more liberal attitude towards the depiction of sex and sexual modes. Hindi often claims the Sanskrit language, arguably, as its immediate ancestor. What does this say of Hindi then, that one of the most famous treatises on human sexual behavior, the Kama Sutra, was written in the Sanskrit language? Indeed, from Sanskrit epics to Hindi literature, Bhasha literature has not refrained from acknowledging and depicting sexual desire, both as initiated by men and by women. The plays of pre-independence writer, for example, Jai Shankar Prasad, especially his, can't actually remember the date and I didn't write it down, but it's sort of fin de siècle, it's called Dhruv Swamini, includes a female protagonist who does not shy away from taking sexual agency, but instead rejects her impotent husband, Ramgupt, for the more virile Chandragupt. Incidentally, Chandragupt is also her former lover, and she is often depicted as ruminating silently on watching us of his manhood, in between inverted commas. Homoeroticism, too, has been part of the Hindi literary tradition. Pandey Bachchan Sharma's 1927, I remember that one, Hindi language collection titled Chocolate. Chocolate is Hindi for chocolate. It's not really Hindi, it's the Hindi pronunciation of chocolate. Includes titillating details of homosexual intimacy. Ruth Vanita points out how Sharma's stories in Chocolate do not actually set themselves as activating in favor of gay rights in colonial India. It was 1927 India. But even then, the portrayal of same-sex desire, where cosmopolitan and educated men quote homoerotic Hindi and Urdu poetry to express love and longing for each other, were risque and not unsympathetic on the whole. Yet, despite this longer history, both Gandhi and Kartikeya produce rather homophobic translations. Gandhi, especially, is guilty of this. The cleanest cuts from Gandhi's text from Said's text in Gandhi, so in his translation, are the passages with homosexual nuances. It should be pointed out that Said himself does not mention the term, so the term homosexual does not actually occur anywhere in A Suitable Boy. But it is impossible not to read its associations with certain characters, such as Varaj Kumar of Mar, especially since Said overtly mentions things like, so this is an example, that example basically. So this is Varaja of Mar, who is the father of the Rajkumar, ruminating on his son's sexual preferences. I don't care how many boys he sleeps with, as long as he gives me a grandson as well. But this sentence is left out of Gandhi's translation, and the Hindi reader consequently never learns of the Rajkumar's sexual preference for men. Instead, Gandhi seeks to posit the Rajkumar as a victim of his father's oversexed, needless to say, heterosexual penchant, by interposing the adjective bichara, literally poor, to describe him. In translating the passage about the Raja forcefully taking the Rajkumar to a courtesan called SIBE in order to make a man out of him, read in that what you will, which basically actually means, make a man. He basically wants to have sex with his son. So this is how Gandhi translated that passage. The original, the origin is on the left again. So on the right, my translation of Gandhi is: just a few days ago, the Raja of Mar took his son to Sayidabai to make him into a man. But the poor thing wanted to run away from there in fright. So instead of revealing the sexual preference of the Rajkumar, the Hindi reader is instead invited to sympathize with the poor Rajkumar for the plight that his immoralistic father subjects him to. The logic that leads Kartikeya and Gandhi, as we have established, cannot be the logic of Bhasha languages, even less of their assumed corresponding cultural differences per se. I would suggest that it is the logic espoused by the political Hindu right. Both Gopal Gandhi and Lalit Kartikeya, in envisaging Hindi as being the carrier of a certain moral code, share the vocabulary of Hindu majoritarianism, sorry, I always get that word wrong, as being the carrier, peddled by such right-wing Hindu organizations as the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh and their various wings, such as the female branch of the organization, the Rashtriya Sevika Samiti, and other political and cultural cohorts under the Sangh Parivar umbrella. I include the BJP in it too, or technically it is, but some people disagree on that. So these organizations have tabooized desire, especially female desire. Just to give some context here, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh is the same organization whose chief, in the wake of the horrific gang rape in Delhi last year, if you've heard about it, came on record to profess that rape would not have happened in Bharat. And by Bharat, he means Bhasha-speaking India. So Bharat is the same name for it, is the Sanskrit name for India, but what he means by Bharat is the part of India or the people of India where Bhasha, Hindi language or Urdu or any of the non-English languages are spoken. Because apparently in Bharat, in Bhasha-speaking India, patriarchal dictates are taught. Rapes, according to the RSS chief Mohan Bhagwat, only happens in English-speaking India, where women have taken control of their own sexual activities. Swati Diaharoi points out how among the organizations such as the RSS, the subject of sexuality, even when broached, is limited to discussions about health, ethics, and reproduction. Desire has no space in their discourse. It emerges from all of this that the patriarchal mindset with which these organizations are rife are based on the assumptions that, firstly, sexuality is obscene, secondly, sexual references dishonor women, and thirdly, sexuality's entry into public space disrupt social boundaries and hence need to be curbed, in a sense. Consequently, sexuality is banished from the pages of the Hindi translation, and women are instead portrayed as paragons of good moral behavior. On Holi, which is a festival depicted in the novel, while watching Man, who's a character in the novel, smear colored powder on her sister. So Holi is this festival where people basically smear colored powder or water, 2 minutes, on each other. In a suitable boy, so Gandhi's Lata does not imagine man's hands on her, nor does she later fantasize about how, and I quote, it would have felt like to be rubbed and smeared by the cheerful man in such a public way. That's that's Seth, of course. Gandhi obviously does not translate any of that. It's completely omitted. Gandhi's Lata instead expresses her reaction with an additional chi Chi is the Hindi equivalent of ew, I suppose, or yuck. In this way, Lata's chi sums up the disgust that Gandhi thinks she's expected as a Hindi speaker to conjure at such unabashed behavior. Hence, both Gandhi and Kartikeya stick to the decorum prescribed by the Hindu rite, including denying the existence of female desire, which is considered a base instinct, and maintaining the patriarchal status quo. What emerges through the translations is the assumption that while a certain sexual liberty or even agency is imaginable for the woman when she is spoken of or written about in the English language, in English her role has to be changed and her portrayal is curbed in keeping with the cultural package, again between inverted commas, that supposedly accompanies the Hindi language. But as I hope to have illustrated, these alterations are due less to the cultural package of Hindi than to the political agendas in which these different languages invariably get wrote. The abduction of Hindi language by the Hindu rite has meant that for some time now, Hindi has developed a certain boundary, of which sex has been completely excluded. Well, this, of course, does not mean that sex is not spoken of in India, and who would believe me if I said that, given the rate at which the country's population is increasing? The common current language in which sex and desire is spoken of, at least publicly, remains English. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Vedita, for a very, dare I say it, stimulating paper. I think we have time for a few questions. I gather we can run just a little bit behind schedule as we started late. So can I invite questions for Vedita?
Shall we wait then?
Yeah. Any questions? Yeah. Yes?
Thank you. It was a really, really interesting paper. I was wondering if it's a question of self-censorship by the translators or whether it's a question of publishers' intervention and editorial.
Yep.
I suppose that's the other question.
Yeah, definitely. Incidentally, both translation was published by the same publisher, Vani Prakashan, which is basically one of the most famous Hindi language publishers in India. Interestingly, the original Hindi writing that they publish, they do publish quite a lot of original Hindi writing, is a lot more, should we say, liberal. And so, for example, maybe about 2 years ago, they published a lot of women's writing, and they got into trouble with the vice chancellor of a Hindi language university, Vibhuti Rai Narayan, I think he was called, who accused these women for basically writing soft porn, where they weren't. I mean, there were random descriptions of sexual activities in their Hindi language novels, but they weren't writing soft porn at all. And the chancellor tried to, basically pressure the publishers not to do that. So I don't really think it is the publisher. I do think both Gandhi and Kartikeya do have a certain warped notion of what a Hindi reader sort of expects from a novel. But I think both Gandhi and Kartikeya are also English speakers. Gandhi, incidentally, is the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi, and he has been, a civil servant and an ambassador in various. So he's quite an elite himself, and the language that he speaks more is actually English. He doesn't actually dabble in. He hasn't written anything except for this translation in Hindi. A lot of his writing is in English. So he's very much of one of those people who occupy, he likes to think, I think, that he occupies two spaces. And it is from that sort of dais that he imagines the Hindi writer to be, the Hindi reader even, to be a sort of, conservative, withering flower kind of, prudish kind of person. So I don't think it's necessarily the Hindi reader's fault, the Hindi reader's expectation rather, not fault, or the publisher's fault. It is the translators, who in this case happen to be elitist. Biased.
And in fact, following on from that, are there any, can you say anything about the reception of these texts by critics, if not by readers? If the readers' expectations are perhaps being met, what about those of the critics?
One famous critic who has reviewed this is Harish Trivedi, who likes it actually, and I really don't like this translation. So I think the reason why he likes it is he thought it made a lot more cultural sense. for someone who's familiar with a lot of the background. So, for example, there are a lot more Bollywood references and popular cultural references in the Hindi translation than there are in say, its original English novel. I think again, it's different. Robert Young doesn't like it. Harish Trivedi likes it. I'm not really sure what that says about it.
It's a question of what you're comfortable with.
Yeah, I
perhaps,
suppose. Yeah, but I think it's been
Mixed.
Mixed, definitely very mixed.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I think that's, or I will ask rather if the problem of the cultural contact for this, which you are emphasizing here, compared to European contact bound to the English language and the way you describe sexuality in English language, if it may be a little more complex, because if you look at the role of the body and everything related to that, from desire to hunger, whatever, in the Christian culture, that is a European cultural contact, then it will be related to sinfulness.
Yeah, definitely.
If you go to the culture of Hinduism, then you have the descending scale of the caste system, where you start with the spiritual and end with the dirtiness of the body and so on and so forth. But I think in both cultures, for different reasons, it's kind of difficult to express at different stages in the cultural history, sexuality and sexual desire. And then even if you go, for instance, to the 18th century pornographic novels in the English as Fanny Hill or something, then even detailed descriptions of sexuality, private parts and so on are always done in metaphorical sense.
Yeah.
And you have these shaking trees and the fire and the romanticism where you project. But I think the interesting thing might be that there are different cultural reasons for doing that.
Yeah.
But the aesthetic strategy which is chosen to kind of circumvent the problem is quite similar.
Yes, certainly.
And I think that's on the surface it looks as if it's the same, but it may be not the same. And that, I think, will influence the question of the reader's reception of it.
Definitely. Yeah, I haven't actually thought about it, but thank you for that. And that's definitely, you're right. I do think I should delve into that a bit more.
So the equivalent indirectness in English is based on a different cultural context.
And also
and
different era.
may work kind of awkward for an Hindi reader.
To read that. Yeah, certainly.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure we can take these discussions forward to the coffee break if we have one. Try to have one. I'd like to introduce my second speaker, please, Eliana Maestri. She's has a PhD from the University of Bath. She's completed a 10-month postdoctoral position at the University of Sydney. She's particularly interested in contemporary autobiographical narratives by English writers and their translations into Italian and French. And today she's considering Le Sucre, the French translation of A.S. Byatt's 1987 story Sugar, research that will be published later this year. So her paper, A.S. Byatt's Sugar and its French translation, Between Autobiography and Autofiction. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The purpose of my paper is to discuss how A.S. Byatt's autobiographical short story, Sugar, has been translated into French and what the differences are against one of the main literary debates of the receiving culture, that is, the querelle between autobiography and autofiction, and against the modern concepts of space as a dynamic dimension. Now, Sugar was published by Byatt in 1987 as a part of a collection of short stories entitled Sugar and Other Stories. It was then translated in 1991 by Jean-Louis Chevalier, a French professor in English literature, within a reduced version of the original collection entitled Le Sucre et autres récits. From an editorial point of view, the main differences between the two collections the main difference is that the French, unlike the English, is introduced by a preface. And this preface claims that Sugar is an autobiography displaying the main traits of the autobiography proper, as first outlined by Philippe Lejeune in 1971, one of the main contemporary theorists of autobiographical writing in France. Now, the preface opens with a typically Legenian declaration of ownership, a sort of revendication du nom propre, which authenticates Le Sucre as a real canonical autobiography founded upon a contract between author, hero, and reader, and upon a male literary model. In this case, the model is represented by Bayet's father's ideas of life-telling around the myth du moi, to use again a Legenian expression, that is, flawless upbringing in a quasi-Garden of Eden, heroic journey through life, and pretenses of exactitude. Now, Lejeune too maps a sort of genealogy connecting through time and space the literary fathers of his autobiography proper, such as Rousseau, Verlaine, Gide, who, like Bayet's father, wrote exemplary autobiographies on a glorious past and nostalgic childhood memories. Now, guided by this preface, the French readers of Le Sucre would then expect to enjoy a classical autobiography in the style of most male writers praised by Lejeune, with the figure of the father as the main character. Instead of this, however, the very first page of Le Sucre is devoted to the mother, who plays a crucial role of transmitter of familiar memories, and in the crumbling of the narrative project, because of her inaccuracies, question the validity of the father's words. Now, French readers might therefore wonder what purpose the preface really serves and why it has been added to the French edition if Bayet's theoretical project, originally outlined therein, clashes with the autobiographical outcome of Le Sucre. Now, the clash is only apparent because the preface enhances the literary role of the father, but it also unveils the secret and meta-literary role of the mother, employed to reflect upon the intrinsic nature of fiction and lies in life writing and more generally in storytelling. However, as the preface was written after the completion of the French translation of Le Sucre, it is reasonable to wonder whether this secret intention was subconsciously present in the author's mind before the start of Sugar, or whether this awareness was raised at a later date, namely as a reflection of what the translation disclosed to the author herself. And in addition to this, we could argue that the preface was added to the French edition to justify the translator's own rereading of the mother-father disputes, and possibly to echo the current literary debate between autobiography and autofiction. And now, to give you a little bit of context, in opposition to Lejeune, Serge Dubronsky coined in 1981 the term autofiction to problematize the nature of truth in autobiographical writing. Grown out of an effervescent period of convergence between post-structuralism and psychoanalysis, Dubronsky wrote his own autobiography Fils in 1971 and a theoretical essay in 1988 to reflect upon the intrinsic nature, aporias, to be found in his own novel. Now, the autobiography autofiction Querelle has since then flourished in France and benefited from the contributions of various scholars, for instance, Gérard Genette, Jacques Lecarme, Eliane Lecarme-Tabon, and Vincent Colonna, who still nowadays consider autobiographical writing and its fictional variations as the most popular mode of writing in contemporary France. Could we also argue that this typically French self-conscious approach to autobiographical writing also informs practices of translation? Now, in order to answer this question, I will analyze only a few examples due to time limits of what I believe is the most interesting and problematic character in the story, that is to say, the mother. Now, unlike the father's linear mode of storytelling, the mother does not follow any chronological or logical order, because her memories are not structured along a coherent or linear time frame. On the contrary, they seem to move across a proliferation of spaces with no clear or rational links. They are tied together by a strong desire to explore familiar places beyond temporal constraints. Now, the dimension that she seems to value the most, however, is the intersubjective space between herself and her daughter, and her daughter Bayet. This is what Kristeva calls maternal enclosure, and what object relation theorist Donald Winnicott calls transitional space. And I'll read for you example 1. My mother had a respect for truth, but she was not a truthful woman. She once said to me, her lip trembling, her eyes sharp to detect my opinion, "Your father says I'm a terrible liar, but I'm not a liar, am I? I'm not." Of course she was not, I agreed, colluding as we all always did, for the sake of peace and of something else, a half desire to help her, for things to be as she said they were. But she lied in small matters to tidy up embarrassments, and in large matters to avoid unpalatable truths. She lied floridly and beautifully in a rare moment of relaxation to make a story better. She was a breathless and a breathtaking raconteur, not often and sometimes over-insistently, but at her best, reducing her audience to tears of helpers' laughter. She also told other kinds of story all the time latterly, all the time we were in a company, monotonous, malevolent, unstructured planes, full of increasingly fabricated evidence of non-existent wickedness. Now, I have underlined the bits that I would like to comment on the French. Now, this passage establishes the centrality of the intersubjective space between the daughter and the mother's face. Winnicott underlines the importance of the mother's face in the development of the child, who perceives the mother's face as a mirror and consequently becomes aware of itself as a separate person from its mother. Now, in French, this intersubjective space is closely rendered, but this very moment of self-awareness by the mother face, and metonymically her eyes, is located in a reconfigured proxemic space where the female protagonists reposition themselves. Now, this is evident in the use, for example, of personal pronouns, elle, vous, je, which, like all main deictics, and here I quote Benveniste, organize temporal and spatial relation around the subject taken as a point of reference. And now Benveniste says that the principal deictic relationship is in fact the I-you speaker-hearer relationship. Now, in French, the repetition of elle, of she, is interrupted by bien sûr que non, which is of course not, which as a free and direct speech echoes the emphatic tone used by the mother, marked only in French by the exclamation mark, and extend the effect of a real conversation between the two subjects placed in face-to-face proximity. Now, the mother acquires a corporeal presence which compensates for the lack of real existence outside the boundaries of the text. The mother-daughter's proximity is also made clear in the French by the translation of colluding, followed in English by the deictic we all as in we all did. Whereas in the English, the children might collude between themselves in order to give the mother the illusion of having things as she wanted them to be, in the French, they concur with her and support her. We've got the French abondant dans son sens. So, in the English, there is a further separation from the mother, who is pushed away from the scene into a space other, remembered but not textually actualized. In the French, there is a realignment which positions the member of the family on the side of the mother and next to her. And the expression abondant dans son sens does not imply any secret or deceitful action against her. There is so no big secret to disclose to the reader and audience, and at this point no audience, no theatrical scene is set to disclose the suspension of disbelief. The maternal enclosure is the only textual space, a space where Bayet and the other children, deictically objectified in the French with tous, support their own mother. Now, the dramatic effect, in brackets we could say, is recovered in the second part of the passage in French, when the narrator moves on to sing the praises of the mother's storytelling, qui vous coupe le souffle. Now, here the deictic vous engages with a virtual audience and reinforces the theatricality of both the mother raconteur and the text. But the intimacy of the French scene prevails. The verb venir, which generally indicates closeness between speaker and hearer in Essaie mes désirs de lui venir en aide, also strengthened the movement to the mother and the intimacy between the children and the mother, making even more explicit their positioning within the maternal enclosure. Now, almost at the end of the passage, another a similar expression, nous lui tenions compagnie, confers a kinesthetic nature on the mother-children relationship that is lacking in the static verb to be, in we were in her company. Now, in this light, the beginning of Le Sucre parodies the classical autobiographer's opening techniques, also criticized by Dobronsky, who explains that classical autobiographies, so warmly praised by Lejeune, flaunts one particular initial aspect, the mirror. The mirror, metaphorical as well as real, is the preferred instrument for the classical male autobiographer, whose physical traits, captured in the space between his own mirror and the stool where he sits, not only reflected the bare physicality of his own body, la solitude romantique du moi seul, they also reflect his moral qualities and faults. Le Sucre, on the contrary, is caught in an almost vertiginous space that the narrator shares with the mother. The authorial solitude is replaced by the tension towards the mother and by the company they maintain with one another. In these terms, the beginning of Le Sucre situates the French translation on a literary path which deviates from l'être pour soi du sujet, that is typical of classical autobiography, and which leads towards l'être pour autrui, a dialogic discovery of the self via the other, advocated by Dobronsky for autofiction. Now, the French translation offers a text full of autofictional reminiscences which portray the prismatic faces of the narrator and enhance the intersubjectivity as a key element in the exploration of the self. Now, the intersubjective dimension, the narrator's geographical sense of the self, and the proxemic space between the mother and the daughter are also displayed through the representation of the house as an embracing space and through the mother figure as a metaphor for the warmth and protection of the house. And I'm referring to example 2, 3, 4, and 5 on the photocopy I've given you. They're very simple examples. You can go through it very quickly. Now, what is important is the iconicity of the enclosed space of the house. We have to say also the iconicity of the enclosed space of the house as a metaphor for the mother and vice versa is also employed by Winnicott, who speaks of maternal environment and environmental mother interchangeably. Now, in Le Sucre, the description of the house and the mother and as the angel of the hearth are all faithfully rendered, but along with the celebration of the maternal enclosure. Now, what is striking is the use of the localizer done, that is in, designing in the French text a circular movement and projecting a new sense of mobility, and dynamism within the maternal embrace. Now, example 6 is quite emblematic at the back of the photocopy. And here Bayet superimposes two paintings and projects the images of her infant self and her mother onto the child and the woman in the picture. In the French, these juxtapositions confer more importance on the mother figure because they link the intimacy of the Dutch painter's house to the intersubjective warmth of the shared mother-daughter space. Now, this is due, as you can see, to the localizer done, which modulates the perception of the maternal enclosure, shortening the distance or proximity between the mother and the child, and relocating the child inside the embrace of the maternal space. So this shift allows the translator to retrieve the mirror and the mother as a constitutive stage of the aesthetic formation of the daughter as a writer, and the significance of the mother-daughter relationship at a personal level. It also allows the translator to give voice to the mother figure, as the localizer done and is, as Bayer says in example 7 on your photocopy, part of my mother's graphic style. The use of done in is part of a language. Now, the figure of the house has also been used as an icon in the autobiography autofiction debate to situate in topographical terms the center and margins of autobiographical writing. Now, despite the fact that the house has always been one of the most favorite sites of exploration in this genre, Lejeune uses it to dismiss autofiction, which is, by means of a pun and untenable case, and a blind and empty case, in French, abode. Yeah? To be blind is a deterrent for the autobiographer who starts by describing, as I said, his image in the mirror. So with this metaphor, Lejeune therefore dismisses autofiction as an invalid and fictional genre which cannot house autobiographical memories. Real autobiography celebrate the romantic individuality of his own male writer and claiming the veracity of his own words is situated, according to Lejeune, in a nice garden, not the house, where the writer enjoys his free and open space. Now, in his defense, Dubrovsky does not reject the icon of the blind house, but elaborates on it. If the house is blind, it is because it reflects a sensory ambiguity upon which autofiction is founded. And here I quote Dubrovsky. C'est de l'écoute de l'autre que la vérité revient dans le discours où le sujet tâche se saisir. Contrary to Lejeune, Dubrovsky highlights the importance in autofictional writing of dialogism and intersubjective exchange founded upon sensory perceptions. What is important is not to sing the solitude of our own past, but to split the romantic individuality of the classical autobiographer to house within this gap a new sensory dimension, namely the voice, the sound, and the truth of the mother, other. This truth is not only fictional, it is subconscious and can be found in the gap between two deictics, moi and ça, the invisible other. Now, to conclude, Le Sucre appeared in a French cultural context which revolved around the autobiography autofiction debate. This debate was congenial to the text. Bayet's preface to the translation addresses issues relating to this debate, and this leads us to think that both the preface and the translation were inspired by this debate and by the role attributed to the mother, metatextually, psychologically and artistically. The almost unexpected yet crucial space devoted to the mother in Sugar must have encouraged the French translator to juxtapose the mother's unorthodox personality with Dubrovsky's challenges to Lejeune's theories on autobiography. The interrelationality that emerges from her stories in French go beyond the Lejeune's récit rétrospective en prose qu'une personne réelle fait de sa propre existence. They invite reflection on the self. So, by shortening the proximity between daughter and child, by enhancing the intersubjective nature of the mother-daughter space, by increasing the significance of the house as a maternal icon of protective warmth, and by intensifying the charge of the maternal imaginative style, Le Sucre celebrates the role of the autofictional writer and the imaginary and spatial encounter with the other. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eliana, for another very interesting paper. Can I invite questions from the floor?
I'm sorry if I missed it at the beginning, but can you tell us who the French translator was?
Jean-Louis Chevalier used to teach English literature in one of the universities in Paris, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. my question would be, your analysis here, as I see it, is more an explanation of why the French translator has made the choices he has made, but not a criticism of the translation. Is that correct? Or would you have suggested? Would you have suggested in some of the cases that he should have done otherwise in order to keep this kind of...
No, I really like this translation myself, but it's a personal opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, it's more to show how new dynamics are reconfigured between within a translation, not to show whether it's good or not. I mean, it's personal preference, I guess. But I mean, my personal preference is that I really like this. If you want to know my opinion, but yeah.
Yeah, because I was looking for something, because there's one of the examples, you have an example 2, where you have the English, and you didn't underline that one, but that was a place where I would have said, well, maybe he's explaining a little too much. Our first wintry visit to the house, in literal French, that would have been la visite hivernale. But of course, here he is changed into visit l'hiver. And there he is kind of removing a very interesting, I think, a metaphor in the English, or trope in the English language. I've forgotten the name for it. I think it's inhalage in French. I'm not quite sure. Where you take the location of an event and turn it into a quality. I mean, it is in winter, that's correct, but it's called the wintry visit. It's not the visit which is winter, wintry, that's a visit that takes place in winter. And there he kind of removes the metaphor in the French translation, because visite hivernale, that would be really strange in French. But I guess in English it's all wintry visit, is not all that. But I think in English, to my foreign ear, it's more kind of in the flow of language. You could say that also in everyday speech, but I don't think in French you would ever say visite hivernale.
No, of course. I mean, some choices are, dictated by the language itself, and some others are, personal preference. I mean, what was important for me when I read the text was this repetition of, as I said, done, and especially, some of them, as I said, it's just the language, but others, when he says, in the skirts of the mother rather than next to the skirt of the mother, for me, it really reflects the fact that, the translator wants to use somehow the language of the mother, and in the text itself it says that this use of done into was really part of the maternal language.
Thank you. And following on from that, in fact, because the text actually opens with, I'm going to tell you about my grandfather, and you have to wait till the end until you get to the grandfather.
Yeah, absolutely.
The focus is actually it's made a sort of a detachment between the narrator and, well, in the French translation, there's more empathy with the mother, whereas in the English original, she's trying to show this distance and this lack of credibility sometimes.
Yeah, that's exactly the point, exactly. And for me, the paratext, the preface, was really a key tool to understand the approach of the translator and also the author herself, because she wrote, as I said, the preface after the French translation. So for me, the French translation was somehow a text that I read, and probably she understood how important herself, the mother, was after the reading the French translation of her text, which somehow
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, exactly. It's wonderful indeed. Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
In fact, she says in the preface at the very end that le sucre, it's a beautiful thing, yet another thing. She says, it's something else.
No,
but
I think it's wonderful if you write a book in which you express your unease with your mouth and you read the translation and something not so disturbing.
Yeah. It's a healing tool.
Absolutely, yes. Well, thank you very much, Eliana, for your very interesting paper. We'll move on to our third speaker. Change your time, please.
Slightly.
my pleasure to introduce, as you already know her, Dr. Caterina Sinibaldi, who's a doctorate from this university. Her research areas are principally Italian fascism and the relationship between translation and ideology. She's published articles on American comics under fascism and on translating Collodi and Lewis Carroll. Today, she examines the status of children's books. She just told me she's changed her title, so better just double check. Yes, the status of children's books and of translations under fascism, with particular reference to the case of Peter Pan.
Thank you. Thank you, Gillian. Okay, so today I will talk about the translation, but especially the rewriting of children's literature and children's classics during fascism, focusing on the significant example of a book series called La Scala d'Oro, published in the 1930s, and on the rewritings of Peter Pan that appeared within that series. And I hope to offer some thoughts on the different functions of translations and rewritings of children's classics in general and in the specific context of fascism. So, what are children's classics? Well, I guess children's classics are better defined by ambiguity, complexity, and asymmetry. In order to be considered a children's classic, a book for children needs to be rooted in a tradition of children's literature, so carrying conservative and traditional narratives, while also transgressing the borders of that tradition. It needs to be topical, so to address the contemporary concerns, but also to use timeless and archetypal themes. So, although classics for children are rooted in their national tradition to the point of becoming representative of a nation, they're also bearers of transcendent meanings, and they must be able to cross linguistic, temporal, national borders, but also to address a dual audience of children and adults, because in order to become a children's book, a book needs to be recognized by adults for its literary value. So, as a consequence of this, children's classics are constantly rewritten and refashioned in order to be appropriate for different audiences across these temporal and geographical borders. And Isabel Desmith said that older classics and children's books are considered to be some kind of common property that might be freely adjusted to the wishes and demands of the target readers. And I would add, in the case of children's classics, more than the wishes and demands of target readers, we are talking about the wishes and demands of the adult society. So these books are adapted according to ever-changing pedagogical discourses and notions of childhood. From the point of view of ideology, when cultural values are presented in children's books, they are most often presented as natural, as reflecting the world just as it is. This is because we assume young readers would be unable to understand a subtle moral message or a too complex symbolic transposition, but also because, particularly in the case of fairy tales, defined by Jacqueline Rose as an uncontaminated record of our cultural infancy, the child seems to have privileged access to a primitive or lost state. And this aspect resonated very strongly with fascist ideology, aiming to restore the true, authentic essence of the Italian nation. Moreover, the coexistence of traditional and progressive or revolutionary elements in children's books was particularly suitable to convey fascist ideology that was precisely based on a narrative of realization, where fascism marked a rupture, a new beginning, while also being presented as a necessary and desirable outcome of Italy's history and traditions. So the child was a very powerful symbol of continuity through renewal that featured in racist and nationalist discourses. However, in practical terms, fascism struggled to produce a significant and successful literature for children, and for this reason, translations of books for children were incredibly widespread and highly enjoyed by Italian readers, although officially criticized and condemned for undermining the hegemonic totalitarian ambitions of the regime. And the condemnation grew stronger over the course of the 1930s, until in 1938 we have a turning point with a conference on children and youth literature, where fascist intellectuals gathered together to discuss the problem of books for children, and they advocated for fascist
books for Italian children that could reflect the contemporary Italian times. And at this conference, a number of books for children were officially condemned, including Alice in Wonderland, Mary Poppins, so children's classics as well. So in a context where foreign books for children were criticized on political grounds, there was a book series for children that almost exclusively published books in translation. This is La Scala d'Oro, published by UTET between 1932 and 1936, and subsequently reprinted. It was highly regarded by fascism and also by the subsequent critics who have praised the series as a space for resistance to the regime's ideology, as this series incredibly showed almost no sign of loyalty to the regime. It developed throughout a succession of 93 graded volumes for different ages that were meant to be collected by children and to accompany them throughout their development as readers. La Scala d'Oro was based on a process of rewriting and re-narration, as I have defined it, of traditional stories. Whether Italian or foreign, this was almost never specified. All the stories were presented as narrate da, told by, an Italian author. So, the consequences of such strategy on the borders of writing and translating are twofold. On the one hand, the translators were very visible because compared to the norm, because their names appeared on the book cover and they were presented as authors. And also the series La Scala d'Oro prided itself in having the best Italian authors for children, in this way gaining acceptance from the regime, as you can see. But on the other hand, these stories were not presented as their creation. Rather, the retellers were mediators who gave voice to a non-specified tradition, making it age-appropriate for Italian children. In many cases, the original author wasn't even mentioned, but this is not the case of Peter Pan, where the author was indeed mentioned, because the book was already quite popular at the time. So we read in the first page, La storia di Peter Pan, so the story of Peter Pan, the tale, Fiaba, fairy tale by J.M. Barrie, retold, narrata da, and then the name of the Italian author. And this book appeared in the first series for very young children aged 6 years old. So, what makes this rewriting of Peter Pan particularly interesting is the fact that two versions were produced within La Scala d'Oro. A first version by a Jewish author, Rosa Herrera, in 1932, that was replaced by a non-Jewish author in 1940, Pia Piccoli Adjoli, and this latter version is the one that survived in all subsequent reprints, even those made after fascism. So the substitution was a consequence of the anti-Semitic legislation introduced in 1938 and aimed at excluding Italian Jews from most professions, including education and publishing. There were other translations of Peter Pan circulating at the time, but the story was obviously retranslated by these authors to fit the conventions of La Scala d'Oro. So the history of Peter Pan, as it was created by James Matthew Barrie, is in itself a history of retranslation and adaptation across different media and for different audiences. Jacqueline Rose talks about the constant dispersion of Peter Pan as challenging any straightforward idea of origin or source. And she concludes by claiming that Peter Pan was a children's classic before it was even a children's book. Peter Pan was not originally intended for children. It first appeared inside a novel for adults, The Little White Bird, in 1902, and then it was made into a theatrical play, Peter Pan or the Boy Who Wouldn't Grow Up. And after several unofficial rewritings of this play had already appeared, Barrie wrote the first official version, Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens, in 1906. So re-narrators could and can draw on a large body of existing texts and traditions. The two versions of Peter Pan that were included in La Scala d'Oro were produced at different times of the regime, but also by very different authors who had different relationships with fascism. The 1932 version carried out by Rosa Herrera is particularly interesting. She was obviously marginalized after the enactment of the anti-Semitic laws for her Jewish heritage. But even before then, the author's detachment from the regime was clear from her literary production and also the literary circles she attended. On the other hand, we have Pia Piccoli-Adjoli, the secondary writer, who actively participated in the life of the regime, in the cultural lives of fascism, and her loyalty to the regime was much more explicit, as we will see later as well. One feature that is common to all the rewritings that appeared in La Scala d'Oro is the explicit presence of the narrator. As I said, they were all presented as narrati da someone. So there's always the voice of a narrator who accompanies the child throughout the story. The narrative voice was already quite dominant, quite audible in Peter Pan by Barry, where there is an identifiable narrator telling the story. However, Barry presented Peter Pan as a joint narration. Although the story is told by an adult narrator, ultimately, the narrative setting is made less conventional by the fact that the narrator's son, David, plays a fundamental role because he can still remember life before birth, given to his very young age. In the two Italian rewritings, the story is clearly framed as being narrata da Herrera and Adjoli. And because the writer, translator, and the narrator coincide, we find that Herrera and Adjoli's voices were superimposed on the original narrator, whose voice completely disappears. Herrera's version still presents the story as the result of a joint narration, whose dynamics are not, however, revealed to the readers. So we have in the Italian, one day a father told the story to his son. The son told the story to the father again with some additions. Adjoli, on the other hand, immediately restores a much more conventional narrative voice by showing an asymmetrical relationship of power between the adult narrator and the child listener. So we have, is it a true story? A boy will ask, one of those children who always want to know everything. All stories are true, a wise father used to say to his children when they would ask him the same questions. But you need to have faith, just like little Peter Pan, who flies because he has faith in flying. So we have this new element of faith being introduced, and also a very strong sense of a hierarchical relationship where the child needs to believe the stories that are, given to him or her. So as the two rewritings progress, their differences become more and more evident, and all throughout the story, for example, Herrera uses frequent diminutives to describe Peter Pan, which are absent from the other writing. So she has a very sympathetic attitude towards Peter Pan, aiming to provoke an emotional reaction in readers. When Peter meets a girl in the garden, the girl is Mamie in the original and Maria in the Italian version. She has got lost in the park. We have in Herrera's version, we can see how Herrera laid emphasis on how the girl pitied Peter Pan for his situation. I want to give you a little kiss, said Maria, little Maria, so you see all the diminutives, impietosita, pitying him. On the other hand, Pia Piccoli-Adjoli describes this relationship in almost a colonial setting where unfortunately, the little savage, so Peter Pan, didn't even know what kisses were. And afterwards, Maria tries to educate Peter Pan to the basic norms of civilization, including kisses, but also other things such as clothes. And it's a very interesting passage. But I would say that the most significant example of how the two strategies of re-narration are very different is to be found in the central scene of the story when Peter Pan goes back to his native house only to find the windows shut. And he realized he's been rejected by his mother and is condemned to live as a child forever. So we read in the original what a glorious boy he had meant to her. Ah, Peter, we who have made the great mistake, how differently we should all act at the second chance. But Solomon was right, there is no second chance, not for most of us. When we reach the window, it is lockout time. The iron bars are up for life. In the first translation by Rosa Herrera, the passage is significantly expanded, and the tragic dimension is intensified by a sequence of rhetorical questions. What a darling boy he could have been to his mother. Why didn't he stop at the house in the first place? Why didn't he stop the last time when he had found the window wide open? Why had he left? His beautiful darling mommy now had another baby, and he had lost his mommy. He didn't have one anymore. Oh, poor Peter Pan. All those who make a big mistake, they wouldn't do it again if they could go back. But you get to the window is shut, is locked, and you can't get in. Never, never, never. Pew, pew, pew. So both rewritings selectively appropriate the tradition of Peter Pan to present it as a cautionary tale, warning child readers about the dangers of disobedience and transgression. However, Herrera's narrative technique clearly positions the text in the 19th century tradition of children's literature, which mainly featured sentimental, tragic stories aiming at provoking an emotional response from the readers. And we can't overlook the political implications of this during fascism, where tradition was seen as challenging the totalitarian hegemonic ambitions of the regime, and in particular, previous children's literature was criticized precisely for being overtly sentimental. Fascist intellectual Marinetti, when advocating the necessity of fascist books for children, had defined pre-fascist books as piagnucolosi, so weepy, emotional. And he called for a more masculine children's literature that could reflect the value of fascism. So Herrera's strategy of re-narration could be seen as a sign of resistance, or at least non-compliance to the regime's discourse. Through, using these conservative strategies, she's resisting to the new values attached to children's literature. And on the other hand, obviously, Adderley's version, she conveys the educational message in a much more sober, rational manner, more in line with the notions of children's literature elaborated by fascist intellectuals and discussed on the occasion of the Bologna Conference. And I'll just go back a second. Sorry, it should be somewhere. Yeah, this is how Pia Piccoli Adderley translates or rewrites the scene of the locked window. So one is quick to make a mistake. It's easy to make a mistake. Then you would like to go back, but it's not possible to come in from a locked window. Full stop. So a much more sober, much more concise.
That's the actual cover, is it?
Yeah, it is.
Him at the window.
Yeah. That's the actual cover from La Scala d'Oro, when Peter has found the window locked shut. So this is. As I was saying, Adderley's version conveys this educational message in a much more sober and rational manner, more in line with the notion of children's literature elaborated by fascist intellectuals and discussed at this conference I already mentioned. And in an article she wrote soon after the conference, she claimed that it doesn't matter to know what a child wants from a book. We need to impose on him or her what the new times, the fascist times require. So the new book should give children pride in being Italian, the conviction that Italians are superior to everything and anyone, and that for an Italian nothing is impossible, apart from entering from a locked window. Even historical truth should be subordinated to this concept. So obviously pedagogical goals and reader's taste were completely subordinate to the regime's political agenda. So even though it's always difficult to judge, whether these claims were honest, were genuine, because we're talking about a dictatorship. However, we can say that Adderley had a much more explicit loyalty to the regime, and she was also aware that she was replacing a Jewish author in the series who had been excluded on the basis of this. So, to conclude, to offer some conclusive thoughts, rewritings of children's classics have a dual function of transmitting literary heritage while also adapting traditional stories to contemporary cultural and educational norms. While Adderley attempts to change the overall tone of the story to make it more aligned with the requirements of fascist children's literature, the first rewriting by Herrera locates the story in a previous tradition of books for children, thus transmitting a literary heritage that challenged the hegemonic ambitions of the regime. What the two stories have in common is that they both present Barry's Peter Pan as part of a universal cultural heritage. So the process of rewriting erases any foreign element that would point to a specific national tradition. And all the rewritings in La Scala d'Oro, in this book series, seem to comply with Paul Hazard's vision of a République universelle de l'enfance. So this idea that there should be a universal republic of childhood where all children can read the same books without borders, without language or national borders. So in their retelling stories framing cultures, Stevens and McCallum argue that processes of rewriting are overwhelmingly subject to a limited number of conservative meta-narratives, thus claiming that rewriting of traditional stories for children most often promote and reinforce conservative views. They also mention the exception of what they call reversions, so cultural icons that are subject to mocking or antagonistic retellings, and we have the example of feminist fairy tales or politically correct rewritings of fairy tales. But what I find very interesting in the case of La Scala d'Oro is that the act of retelling, re-narration of tradition can also perform a subversive function. The book series La Scala d'Oro presented itself as a compendium of the books any child should read. And the fact that so many were foreign had clear political implications during fascism. But because these were concealed by the process of re-narration, which blurred boundaries between translation, adaptation, recreation, they were made acceptable in the eyes of the regime. So tradition served as a way of escaping the pervasive narratives of the regime, or at least avoiding any direct reference to present Italy. So disguising foreign stories as belonging to a universal, almost timeless tradition allowed for their circulation at a time when translations of books for children were strongly condemned and met with hostility by fascism. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Caterina, for a third very illuminating paper. I think we have time just for a couple of questions before coffee. Enrico.
Caterina, does this feed, in your opinion, into the development of the anti-fascist generation?
Does this feed?
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, because it's 32, 36. So
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think it does, actually. I mean, my argument is that children who grew up during fascism, although the regime tried to limit their access to foreign books because of all these strategies that were enacted, they actually had access to a very, broad tradition of foreign children's literature through a book series such as La Scala d'Oro, but also others. And then, of course, there is the case of, children's comics, foreign comics, American comics that were also circulating at the time. So I do think that children had access to foreign narratives. Although I have to say La Scala d'Oro was quite an elitist product because it was very expensive for the time, so it probably wasn't so widespread as other publications.
Thank you. Other questions?
Have you, in this sort of context, have you looked at the school textbooks for the early years of fascism? Because all sorts of stories are retold in a fascist mould in those textbooks.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're trying to produce young fascists through their everyday schooling.
Yeah, I didn't really dwell on that in the paper, but of course, there was a very widespread strategy of indoctrination, especially in the school. And I think one very interesting example of what you say, where the case of this writer called Nonno Ebbe, Grandpa Ebbe, who rewrote fairy tales in a fascist manner. So, and they were promoted at school as well, these kind of books. So obviously, there was also the rewriting of tradition in fascist terms. And another of my case studies is the fascist rewriting of Pinocchio, but that's even different because that's an internal classic that is being, updated and retranslated in an intralingual transposition.
And in fact, talking about retranslations, if one wanted to purchase one of these early fascistic, whatever the word is, versions of Peter Pan? Are they still available? Are they popular? Are they banned? Or have they been
they're incredibly that difficult to find.
Well, yeah, I mean, Katrina and I were having this discussion the other day, and it's very interesting because when you start looking for these things, I've done it in Rome over a number of years because of interest in that period, and you're going through the bancarelle, the stalls, and people, when they see what you're looking at, will come and say, if you're interested in this kind of thing.
It happened to both of us.
It's happened to both of us. But the other thing that Katarina was telling me the other day was that if you try to buy some of the fascist labelled things, they're incredibly expensive.
Yeah, because they're for collection.
So there's a clear market. What that tells you is there's a clear market. It may be a niche market, it's a very secretive market, but it's huge market.
There is a market on eBay for sure, because every time I Google any of these books, the first thing is always something on eBay that's like €1,000. So I'm not joking; they're incredibly expensive, and there must be.
I have bought books from the same period which are not labelled as fascist.
Oh yeah.
For €40, 36 euros. You try to buy the ones which belong to the tradition. The price just goes whoa.
Well, thank you very much for all my speakers this morning. Thank you, Gillian. Thank you.